You are 23 years old, and you have never built anything that could kill someone. That changes today. It's 1961. You're standing in a government hiring hall in Houston, Texas, holding a degree in aerospace engineering from a university that didn't exist 10 years ago. You're wearing the only suit you own. Your shoes are slightly too small. The man across the desk doesn't ask about your grades. He asks one question. Do you want to go to the moon? You say yes before he finishes the sentence. You don't think about what the question actually means. You're 23. You think about the rocket. You think about the math. You think about your name on the mission report, filed somewhere in a government archive, permanent and untouchable. You think about telling your father, who spent 30 years on an assembly line in Ohio, that his son is building the machine that will change human history. You don't think about the weight of it. You don't think about what happens if the math is wrong. You will. They give you a badge and a desk in a building with no windows. The Mission Control Complex is still under construction. Half the equipment is theoretical. Half the procedures don't exist yet, because nobody has ever done this before, and there is no manual to copy from. You are not working from a blueprint. You are the blueprint. The Soviet Union already put a man in space. Yuri Gagarin went up on April 12, 1961. He came back. The headlines treated it like a declaration of war, and in a way, it was. President Kennedy stood before Congress 3 weeks later and told the country that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Before the decade is out. It is 1961. You have 9 years. Except you don't. Because the actual math of what Kennedy promised requires hardware that doesn't exist, procedures that haven't been written, and solutions to engineering problems that haven't even been identified yet. The timeline isn't ambitious, it's a dare, and you said yes to it. Your first assignment is the environmental control system for the command module. You are responsible for the air the astronauts breathe, the pressure inside the capsule, the temperature, the mixture of gases that keeps 3 human beings alive in a vacuum at 250,000 miles from the nearest hospital. You are 23 years old, and 3 men's lungs depend on your arithmetic. Welcome to NASA. The first 2 years are intoxicating. You work 80 hours a week and you don't notice, because the work feels like the most important thing any human being has ever done. And maybe it is. Every morning you walk into that building and you are part of something that has never existed before. The engineers around you are the best in the world, and they know it, and you know it, and the whole operation hums with the specific arrogance of people who are certain they are right. You run simulations, you run them again. You find problems before they become failures, and you fix them, and you document the fix, and you run the simulations again. This is the job. Not glory, not speeches, a desk, a calculation, a test, a result, a correction, repeat. You learn to read a failure report the way a doctor reads an X-ray. You see the break before you see the bone. Your supervisor calls you the best fault analyst on the environmental team. You are 25 years old, and you have never felt more certain of anything in your life. The program is moving. Mercury gives way to Gemini. Gemini gives way to Apollo. With each mission, the hardware gets more complex, the stakes get higher, the timeline gets tighter. The pressure from above is constant and specific. Washington wants results. The public wants drama. The astronauts want to not die. You want to give them that. You want it more than you have wanted anything. And for a while, you believe you will. January 27th, 1967, is a Friday. You are at your desk when the call comes. Not a simulation, not a drill. A fire inside Apollo 1 on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy during a routine pre-launch test. The hatch cannot be opened from the inside. It takes 17 seconds for the crew to lose consciousness. It takes 5 minutes for ground crews to open the hatch from the outside. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. 3 men. A test that was supposed to be so routine, it was classified as non-hazardous. A pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule at higher than atmospheric pressure. A design you worked around. A design everyone worked around. A design that turned the command module into a pressure vessel full of kindling, waiting for a spark. You spend the night at your desk staring at documents you have read 100 times. You are looking for the moment you should have seen it coming. You will spend the next 2 years doing this. Here is the thing nobody tells you about catastrophic failure in high-stakes engineering. The failure is never one thing. It is never one decision made by one person on one afternoon. It is 100 small decisions that each made sense individually and combined into something fatal. It is a culture that moved fast because the timeline demanded it, and called the speed confidence. It is a risk assessment process that classified a scenario as acceptable because it had never occurred before. It is a system that worked and worked and worked, and then stopped working in 17 seconds on a Friday afternoon. You were part of that system. You didn't cause the fire. You didn't design the hatch. You weren't in the room that night. But you were part of the system that produced the room that night. You carry that distinction for the rest of your life, and you never fully decide if it means anything. They don't shut the program down. This is the thing that surprises people who weren't there. There is no pause. There is no national conversation about whether to continue. There is a review board and an investigation and a redesign effort. And the whole machine swallows the tragedy and keeps moving. Because the alternative is conceding the decade to the Soviet Union, and nobody in Washington is willing to do that. So you go back to work. The redesign takes 18 months. Every system is reviewed. Every material in the command module that can burn is identified and replaced with something that won't. The hatch is redesigned to open outward and fast, a change so obvious in retrospect that you cannot look at the original design without feeling something in your chest that has no clean name. You work on the new environmental control specifications. You test them. You test them again. You test them in conditions that replicate every failure mode you can imagine, and several you have to invent, because the ones you could imagine already happened. You do not sleep well during this period. Not because of the workload, though the workload is total. You don't sleep well because every time you close your eyes, you are running the calculation again, looking for the thing you missed the first time, wondering if you are missing it again right now. This is what the movie version of this story always gets wrong. It shows the engineers as confident. It shows them as certain. The reality is that the most dangerous thing in that building is false certainty, and every serious engineer knows it. The ones who survive long careers in this work are the ones who never stop being afraid of what they haven't thought of yet. You are afraid. Every day for 2 years, you are afraid. You do the work anyway. There is no other option. There are never any other options. The work is the only thing standing between where you are and another fire. July 16th, 1969. Apollo 11 lifts off from Kennedy Space Center at 9:32 in the morning. You watch from the viewing area with 2,000 other NASA personnel. The Saturn V rocket generates 7.5 million pounds of thrust at ignition. The ground shakes under your feet. Your chest shakes with it. You have a badge. You have 8 years of calculations in filing cabinets behind you. You have a scar tissue layer on your conscience from a Friday afternoon in January 2 years ago. You have not slept properly in longer than you can remember. You watch the rocket climb, and you feel something that is not triumph and not relief and not pride, though it contains traces of all three. It is something quieter and more complicated than any of those things. It is the particular emotion of someone who knows exactly what it took to get to this moment and cannot fully separate the beauty of the moment from the cost of it. 4 days later, at 4:17 in the afternoon on July 20th, the lunar module Eagle lands in the Sea of Tranquility. Neil Armstrong's voice comes through the speakers in Mission Control. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The room erupts. People are crying. People who have never cried at work in their lives are standing at their consoles with their faces in their hands. You are one of them. You don't try to stop it. 6 hours later, Armstrong steps onto the surface of the moon. You think about Gus Grissom. You think about Ed White. You think about Roger Chaffee. You think about them every time someone calls this an unqualified triumph. Not because you want to diminish what happened on July 20th, 1969, because you know that the line between triumph and catastrophe was never as wide as the celebration implies. You know how many times the math was almost wrong. You know how many problems were solved in the last hour before they became mission-ending failures. You know the thickness of the margin. The world sees a man on the moon. You see every decision that could have gone differently. You work at NASA until 1974. By the time you leave, you have worked on 4 more Apollo missions. You have watched Apollo 13 nearly kill 3 more astronauts in 1970, an oxygen tank explosion 200,000 miles from Earth, a crisis solved by the same kind of desperate real-time engineering that built the program in the first place. You have watched the country's appetite for space exploration peak in the summer of 1969 and begin its long decline almost immediately after. You leave for the private sector. Better pay, more reasonable hours, work that does not require you to consider on a daily basis whether your calculations will determine whether someone lives. You are 36 years old, and you feel 60. The program gave you something that has no market value and cannot be transferred. The specific knowledge of what it costs to do something that has never been done before. The knowledge that progress is not a clean upward line. It is a broken thing, assembled from failures and corrections and the occasional catastrophe that forces everyone to stop and reckon with what they missed. You know what it feels like to be part of a system that worked. You know what it feels like to be part of a system that failed. You know that the difference between those two outcomes was smaller than anyone watching from the outside will ever understand. On the wall of your home office, you have one photograph. Not the famous one of Armstrong on the moon. Not the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. A photograph of your desk in Houston in 1966. Papers everywhere. Coffee cups. A slide rule. A trash can overflowing with discarded calculations. The work that nobody photographed. The work that made everything else possible. That's the job. That was always the job. So here you are. You came in as a 23-year-old with a degree and a suit with shoes that were slightly too small. You leave as someone who helped put a human being on the surface of another world. That is an objectively extraordinary thing to be able to say. It cost you more than you expected, more than anyone told you it would cost. The years, the sleep, the Friday in January 1967 that lives in you like a splinter that never fully came out. Would you do it again? Most of the engineers who worked Apollo say yes. Not without hesitation, not without acknowledging what the program cost, in full, but yes. Because the alternative is a world where it never happened at all, and that world is worse. This story is based on the real history of the Apollo program and the engineers who built it. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were real. The Apollo 1 fire was real. Everything the engineers carried afterward was real. Here's what I want to know. If you were in that building on January 28, 1967, the day after the fire, would you have gone back to work? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe. There are more of them coming, every one of them true, every one of them worse than you expected. The life ladder, every rank, every level, every life.